Today, we have with us a very old and dear friend and a loyal supporter of the John Locke Foundation. Fred Barnes began coming down to Raleigh, gosh, it was in the early 90s, if not sooner than that. Well, the John Locke Foundation didn't start until 1990, but he has been here numerous times over the years. Fred is a dear friend, as I said. He helped, he's the co-founder and executive editor of the Weekly Standard, a magazine I hope you all read. He was the national political reporter for the Baltimore Sun from 1979 to 1985, and then Fred did a 10-year stint at the New Republic as a senior writer and Washington correspondent. And Fred has a very interesting story about his time at the New Republic with someone here. Many of you may know that, but I'm sure Fred will talk about that in a bit. He was on the McLaughlin Group for a number of years. I'm sure you saw him there. And also, you saw him on Fox News quite a bit when he appeared with Mort Kondracki on the Beltway Boys. But Fred has been, as I said, a longtime supporter of the John Locke Foundation. Fred has also been instrumental in being a mentor for a number of young journalists who've come up and have become very prominent over the years, and that's very important for the profession indeed. So Fred is here today to talk about his new book, which is Jack Kemp, the Bleeding Heart Conservative Who Changed America. And we will have the book on sale afterwards for $20. I'm sure Fred will be glad to sign those books as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Fred Barnes.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me again. You know why I'm here. I'm here for really two reasons. One is you'll do anything to promote a book. Anything. Garland knows this, and others who've written. John, you know it as well. And the other reason is I just like coming here. And I have, as Corey said, I've been here many, many times, talking and really have enjoyed it over the years, and gee, it must have been off and on over 20 years or something like that. The young journalist that I think Corey was referring to is, of course, John Hood, who was an intern of mine. How many years ago? Really? 1988, 89. That was when I was at the New Republic, and which is virtually non-existent now. At least it's invisible to me. The New Republic magazine, which was an important magazine back then. And I enjoyed working there. And I was glad to see John. John, stands out in my mind. I was mentioning this to Corey again. Stands out in my mind. When young people come to Washington to be in journalism in Washington, there is one thing they are certain of. They're not leaving. They want to be in Washington. I mean, this is the journalistic capital of the world, really, but particularly in America. It used to be New York, but it's not anymore. And John was the only one who, from the first time I talked to him, said, well, I'm glad to be here for this as an assistant here, but I'll be returning to North Carolina when it's over. And he did. And of course, the rest is history here with the John Locke Foundation and the magazine they put out and just all that's been done down here with the John Locke Foundation. I've spoken it and know a lot about these state think tanks, and John Locke Foundation is right at the top of the list. I mean, there's some pretty good ones. There's some pretty poor ones. I live in Virginia, which doesn't have much of a think tank that is which would really be essential to helping the legislature. But North Carolina does. And the John Locke Foundation has just been, it's indispensable now, as I guess most of you all know. If you don't, it is indispensable. Take my word for it. It really is. I have a one-page speech. That's pretty, but don't be confused. That does not mean it's going to be brief. That just remind me of some things that I want to talk about. In the past, I've had rather extensive notes and, 18, 19 pages. I don't know why I went through that. Well, I know why. When I first started giving speeches, I went to a speech, and this must have been in 1976, actually, and I saw Ronald Reagan with his note cards. And I thought, look, this guy's the best speaker in the universe. Maybe I should just have note cards. And, but after a while, you'd get you start with about 10, and then all of a sudden you have 12, and then you have 14, and it gets pretty onerous. And so I'm down to one page now. Then here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about Jack Kemp. I'm going to talk about the Republican presidential race. I'm going to talk about the Democratic race. And there really is one. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Syrian refugees issue, and talk about the book by Bill O'Reilly of Fox called Killing Reagan, which I know a little about, whether it's true or false, what's written about in that book. And I'll give you a hint. It's false. Jack Kemp was an amazing guy. I knew him pretty well, which is one of the reasons that I knew him better than Mort did, and I wrote more about him than Mort Kondracki, my co-author, did, although Mort did a huge oral history of Jack Kemp, financed by the Kemp Foundation and the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. But Kemp was really an extraordinary figure. And, well, I'll start by telling you my favorite story in the book. And it's about Kemp at the 1980 Republican Convention in Detroit. And the speech, well, it's about his speech, or a speech. And Kemp, remember, that was the convention where Ronald Reagan was nominated for the first time, and then, of course, won the election and became a great president. But Kemp was scheduled to speak on the second night of the convention, which would have been Tuesday night. And he had a great spot. He was going to speak after Barry Goldwater and before Henry Kissinger. He'd be in the middle there, prime time, between 10 and 11. Can you imagine that? I mean, Kemp was an extraordinary figure in the House, but because of all he'd done with supply-side economics and the tax cuts and things. But he wasn't a well-known national figure, well-known in the Republican Party, though. Anyway, this was one of the greatest things that ever happened to him. So you get around to that night, and Barry Goldwater comes on at 10 and speaks, and speaks, and speaks, and speaks, and just continues talking. I guess Barry Goldwater by that time didn't have that many shots at national speeches. And so Mike Deaver, you remember him, worked for Reagan, calls down from wherever the headquarters was at the convention, calls down and says, hey, look, we got to get Kissinger on, and Goldwater's gone so far, we're going to have to kill the Kemp speech, and we'll get him on the Wednesday night. And so Deaver calls down and actually talks to Kemp and tells him, I'm sorry, we just can't have you on. And Kemp accepts it and wanders off into the crowd on the floor of the convention. And so then they call down to tell have the woman who does the introductions to introduce Henry Kissinger. Well, there's another person there, the guy who happened to be in charge of the woman down there, and he was a member of Congress, a friend of Jack Kemp, and he told her, I'm blanking on his name right now, Tommy Evans, very good. Mark Rotterman helped me. Tommy Evans, not a well-known guy, but Tommy Evans was in charge of the young woman there, and she was ready to introduce Kissinger, and he tells her, don't introduce Kissinger, introduce Jack Kemp. And Tommy Evans, was a member of the House. He was a friend of Jack Kemp. He liked Jack Kemp. He agreed with Jack Kemp. He liked these supply-side tax cuts, but the woman wanted to. This poor woman wanted to introduce Henry Kissinger. He said, "Don't introduce Jack Kemp. Introduce Jack Kemp," and she finally does. And so Kemp's chief of staff at the time was a fellow named Dave Smick, who all of a sudden hears the woman announcing, and he was a quarterback for the San Diego Chargers. And he knew right away, wait a minute, they're introducing Kemp. And they couldn't find him. Here he was, he's out in the audience. You know, there are thousands of people on the floor of a convention. And finally, they saw him because they could see his head of hair above some people, and they get him up on the stage, and he goes and he gives the first two lines of his, reads them off the teleprompter, and then wings it for the rest of his speech. Goes all the way to 11 o'clock, bumps Henry Kissinger out of prime time, but gives the speech of his life, Kemp does. And, you know, it's just remarkable. So the heroes of our book are Jack Kemp, Ronald Reagan, and Tommy Evans. You know, and Kissinger, you know, when I think about that, I think, you know, Kissinger being knocked into prime time, out of prime time by Jack Kemp, that, you know, there really is a God. when you think about that. And by the way, Mark Rotterman helped me on the name Tommy Evans. It's amazing when you get older how you blank on names, isn't it? You all are probably not familiar with his father, Lou Rotterman, who worked for Jack Kemp all through the 70s when Kemp was becoming a national figure. And not only was Lou Rotterman his press secretary, he basically had to take over the Buffalo franchise, because Kemp was around, you know, campaigning all around the country, becoming this a really influential figure. He didn't have any, you know, he wasn't on the Ways and Means Committee or anything, but that left back in his office, somebody had to take charge of the whole Buffalo thing. So Buffalo didn't think they were being entirely ignored and so on by Jack Kemp, although to an extent they were, because he couldn't speak around the country and be in Buffalo at the same time. Anyway, that was Lou Rotterman, who was a great and influential figure with Jack Kemp, believed in Kemp and the whole supply side effort, and was a really important figure, and was Mark's father. The first line of the book says this, that Jack Kemp was the most important politician in America in the 20th century who was not president. And the rest of the book is basically to substantiate that point. And I think we do a pretty good job. But the most important thing that he did, and that lifted him above all other politicians in America in the 20th century who were not president, and of course there are a lot of those, was what he did in creating this supply-side movement, championing tax cuts across the board in the individual income tax rate. You know, not tax credits for any number of things that people support tax credits for. There's a great editorial in the Wall Street Journal today about all these tax credits that Hillary Clinton's for, and a lot of Republicans are for tax cuts. A tax cut if you have a large family, or even if you have a family, and so on. Supply side was different. And the idea was to create incentives, to stir investment, to promote work and savings and jobs. What you did was cut individual tax rates across the board. And in the first case, in the tax cuts, after Reagan was brought on board, championed them, ran on them, 30% across the board tax cuts in 1980, and then compromised slightly, and they became 25% when he sent them to Congress, was passed, and but these were different. And then, anyway, initially the top rate on income went from 70 to 50%, and then with tax reform, also promoted by Reagan and Kemp, in 1986 it went down to 28%. Remember when the top rate was 28%? And remember how strong the economy was for 20 years after the initial tax cuts? If it hadn't have been for Kemp going to Reagan and putting this thing together, Kemp had already put together a movement nationally that included a number of economists, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, Bob Novak, the columnist, a good friend of mine who really promoted Kemp and supply-side economics, these smart young members of Congress elected in the 70s. Remember Newt Gingrich? Well, he's still around, but he was elected in 78, became an acolyte of Kemp. Connie Mack in Florida, and Vin Weber from Minnesota, and so on, a number of them. And anyway, Kemp put together this movement, got to Reagan, persuaded Reagan, and the rest is this glorious economic history that America experienced in the 1980s and 90s and into the 21st century. And that's really why we wrote the book. For Kemp, this was not only a political achievement, but an intellectual achievement. When I look here, there are many of you all who can remember the 70s and how miserable they were. High unemployment, high inflation. Remember, this is when Jimmy Carter invented the misery index. Remember that? It was when you would add the rate of unemployment to the rate of inflation, and it got up under Carter, I think, something like 23%. Well, under Reagan in the mid-'80s, it was down to 7.7%. Remarkable achievement, which indicates how much better the economy was, how much happier people were. I mean, looking back, can you think of somebody running for re-election? Barack Obama didn't try this, running as Reagan did in 1984 on It's Morning in America. Think of that. It's morning in America? Then, look, George W. Bush couldn't say that. I like George W. Bush, but he couldn't claim that. And, of course, Obama couldn't, a president running for re-election. Kemp was self-taught. He majored in phys ed in college, and he didn't study that much. He played football. That's all he cared about. He was a terrible student, and he didn't pay much attention to his studies. I don't know how he got C's even, but then he decided, he got interested and started to learn economics by reading. Boy, what an old-fashioned way to do it, reading. And read all these economics books, some of which I couldn't get through. Ludwig von Mises, you ever tried him? Very important Austrian economist, but Kemp read him. Hayek, Milton Friedman, and so on, and became self-taught in a very, very complete way. Could talk convincingly about international economics, monetary policy, not just tax cuts, and could always win the arguments. If you disagreed with Kemp, you didn't want to argue with him. But self-taught, just think of that. It shows how smart he was. And there's also this Kemp model of a politician. We write about this, in particular, a politician who didn't attack personally other Republicans, much less, or Democrats in particular, who believe that it really, as Ronald Reagan did, that if you can compromise and get 80% or something like that, go ahead and do it. Always wanted to work with Democrats when it was possible, and back in the 70s, it was a bit more possible than it is today in Washington, and also believed strongly that you could take conservative principles and take them to poor communities, African American communities, Hispanic communities, immigrant communities, all over the country, and the same philosophy that most of us believe in would work there too, and was always looking for converts there. And talked about how marginal tax rate cuts would help them, particularly when people were leaving welfare, got a job and they would lose their government benefits, and which meant that they had a tax rate that was a lot higher than the ones most of us in this room have. And enterprise zones, and school choice, and on. Conservative ideas that Kemp was convinced were the best thing that could happen to poor communities. And he convinced some. He didn't have enough time to really carry that out completely, and others, like Paul Ryan, have taken it up. Paul Ryan, now the House Speaker, is his acolyte. Sat outside when he got out of college from Miami of Ohio, and he'd had a pretty good free market professor there in economics, and Paul Ryan did major in economics and did study. Unlike Kemp, didn't play football. He left that to Ben Roethlisberger, but later. But his first job, one of his first jobs in Washington, was as Kemp's assistant at a think tank called Empower America. Doesn't exist now, but and that's where he really learned about supply side economics and became Kemp's acolyte. You talk to Ryan, and while he's not this dynamic former pro football player that Kemp was, he sounds like Kemp because his beliefs are the same, and it's already making a difference with Paul Ryan as House Speaker. I don't mean that in any way to condemn John Boehner, but Paul Ryan is just a different figure. He's so much like Kemp and so well liked. The Republican race, I'll move on to that quickly. I think what's going to happen, normally, what does normally happen? You have the Iowa caucuses, and they're going to be February 1st this year. don't influence what happens that much afterwards. And then you have the New Hampshire primary, February 9th, which always does. And traditionally, 2 candidates have come out of it. The ones who do first and second, usually in New Hampshire, and you have a mainstream candidate, which today would be called the establishment candidate, I guess, although that's not a word that many of those candidates embrace. But the mainstream candidate, and then you have an outsider and an insurgent, or whatever you want to call the other candidate. So that's what would usually happen. But you didn't start with 17 candidates like you do, like you started this year. So you may get 3, 4 candidates come out of Iowa. And why would the other candidates have to drop out? You know, what happens, why is Iowa so influential? Because if you don't do well, one, the media stops writing about you. They don't cover you anymore. They ignore you, and that hurts. And secondly, people who have been giving you money, they stop giving you money because they think it's it's not going to be helpful, and they turn to the other candidates. So coming out of, you can see coming out of New Hampshire, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, probably Ted Cruz, maybe Chris Christie, because he's really concentrated on New Hampshire, has done well in debates, and it's just a very good candidate, actually. I mean, you see him in the debates, and you see how good he is at what he does. And then you go to, after that, you have South Carolina, but you know, now is a time, you know, when everybody, I'm sure you've heard people, because I've said this to people many times, these debates now, rather these polls now, forget about them. They don't matter. But they're going to begin to matter. They're going to begin to become predictive. And when we get later in December, you know, people will have started really paying attention in Iowa, New Hampshire, and even other early states, and they will be more indicative of how people are going to actually vote when it comes to that, you know, some weeks later. But we haven't seen that yet in the polls. They've been, although it's extraordinary. I mean, the one extraordinary thing, well, there've been a number of extraordinary things too. Where the way, one is of course Donald Trump, not only with the high numbers, but sustaining them. Remember, he was first in polls in July, and he's been there pretty much since then, and he's first in polls in Iowa and New Hampshire right now. We'll see what happens. But after that, since New Hampshire affects everything, you don't know. The polls in South Carolina a week later don't mean anything now, because they'll be affected. You'll have many fewer candidates, and so all these candidates who are out of the race, the people who supported them in Iowa and New Hampshire, they're going to vote for somebody else. I've left out Jeb Bush, whom, I mean, look, I think he'll still be around. I mean, he's run, I like Jeb Bush. He was a great governor of Florida, but he's run a miserable campaign personally. That was Scott Walker's problem as well. You know, it started in both. I mean, Scott Walker, for one, and it's also true of Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, were people who lost votes when Trump was picking up votes, for sure. And I know the Perry people blame Donald Trump, but that's the way politics works. So, I mean, there's no reason to feel sorry for them. I don't know where Bush goes. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to imagine him. I think he'd be a very good president, but I don't see where his vote's going to come from, because other people have done so much better. So you come out with 4 candidates. They go to South Carolina. They don't really compete in the caucuses in Nevada much. Then you're going to have all these primaries on March 1st. I live in Virginia. That's one of them. Texas. There are 10 primaries that day, big day, called the SEC primary, you know, the Southeast Conference, because I think Alabama's that day and a bunch of southern states. And finally, you get around to March 15th, which by then, and you all are going to be voting on March 15th, which is another big primary day. After that, I think you're going to wind up with 2 or 3 candidates, because the others just wouldn't be able to sustain themselves. And right now, if I had to predict who they're going to be, I would say they're going to be Donald Trump, it's going to be Marco Rubio, and it's going to be Ted Cruz. I mean, Ted Cruz is a pariah in Washington. All the other senators dislike him, and very few House members like him. The press doesn't like him, the mainstream press, but he's a great presidential candidate. He really is good. I was talking to Frank Luntz, who does, I'm sure you've seen him on Fox if you watch, he does all these focus groups. He did a thing, and he doesn't like Ted Cruz much, but he, a week or 10 days ago, did a forum with 7 of the presidential candidates in Iowa, and I asked him, I said, well, who did well? And he said, Ted Cruz did by far the best out in Iowa. Ted Cruz has been gaining ground in Iowa. I haven't mentioned Ben Carson, who I actually know fairly well, and I just don't know where he's going to be. He's hard to predict. I understand why people like him. They've read his books. They know he was this great brain surgeon, and I think they see they haven't been overly concerned about his lack of knowledge about foreign policy and domestic policy and the stuff that candidates who've been in politics a while talk about fairly fluently. But at some point, I think that's going to matter. But in any case, now I think people see something when they've read his books and know about him, and his Christian faith is important too in this. They see something that they think is there and and is why they like him for president. I mean, I wouldn't call it magic, but just some internal strength and class and morality and all, and they just think he's such an extraordinary individual, though not somebody from the political class, that well, we'll see how his support does. Iowa's a good place to look. The Democratic race. I don't know whether any of you all, I bet you haven't, because you don't have to. You don't have to watch the Democratic debates. I have to watch them. This is not fun. The last one, I went to a basketball game and read the transcript. It was just easier to do. It was just I couldn't stand another one. But there are 3 people there. Martin O'Malley, who they left as the Maryland governor. Maryland is a very deeply Democratic state, elected a Republican, Larry Hogan, as governor last fall, almost entirely on the basis of his attacks on what O'Malley left behind in Maryland. O'Malley's a non-starter. And then you have Sanders, Bernie Sanders, the governor of a senator from Vermont, who is a socialist, a guy whose understanding of the way economics works in America or around the world is totally lacking. He knows nothing. He doesn't understand anything about tax rates, about incentives. All he knows about is government should spend money on everything. It's just incredible. All you have to do is just, lift the cap from the Social Security tax. That's all you have to do, as if they're not repercussions from that, the biggest tax cut hike in the history of the world. And he thought, oh, well, just, knock off the cap. That's all you got to do. And Hillary always says that her response is, when how to pay for something, we'll make the rich pay. When you watch their debates, and they've had 2 of them now, the word or the 2 words attached to each other, and the economic growth, literally never come up. They don't talk about that at all. They don't understand that there is a tremendous difference in a country, in America, when it has 2% growth or less, as we do now, and 4% growth. It's all the difference in the world. Jack Kemp said this, by the way, in a speech in 1979 to Longshoremen, the Longshoremen's Union. He said, in a stagnant or contracting economy, politics becomes the art of pitting class against class, rich against poor, white against black, capital against labor, sun belt against snow belt, old against young. And we see that now. I mean, Donald Trump has certainly fostered some of that antagonistic feeling among groups. President Obama's done more than anybody else to stir animosity among Americans about each other. But at 4%, people are happier. They have jobs, wages are rising, and it can make all the difference in the world. Bernie Sanders doesn't have a clue. It really is amazing to see some guy, even a socialist, as he says he is, would understand that. And you would think Hillary Clinton might have learned something over the years, but or even Barack Obama might have, but he hasn't either. You know, what you do to spur an economy that creates jobs and so on, and private investment has a lot to do with it. And that's another thing that's never mentioned, these Democratic debates, private investment and the jobs that it creates. Anyway, I'm not advising you all to watch them, but when you hear that there's a Democratic debate, say a little prayer for me that I can get through it, because they really are bad. Next week, an issue is going to come up, December 11th, when they have to renew spending for the government. New budget, and one of the issues is going to be the Syrian refugees, 10,000 of whom, as you know, Obama wants to bring into the U.S. next year. 10,000. Now, they passed a bill in the House with a veto-proof majority. They got 47 Democrats to vote for it, that says basically it says, well, look, we need to have a pause here. Let's not have this now. Let's make sure that the FBI or whoever really does put together a system of vetting and interrogating and making sure that among this 10,000, they're not terrorists who are trying to sneak in as refugees, as legitimate refugees. And, ISIS, which is pretty frank about what it does, said, well, this is, of course, what we're doing in Europe. And Obama pretends that, well, Republicans, they just want to, they're worried about 3.5-year-old orphans and widows and so on, typical snarky stuff that you hear from President Obama now. Well, the question is, are you going to, Obama says, if even that mild Republican bill provision is left in the spending bill, he will veto it. Now, so far, whenever he says he's going to veto something, Republicans have backed down. Mitch McConnell has, certainly John Boehner did, to avoid a shutdown. And you know the history of shutdowns. When the government shut down, Republicans get blamed even when it's not their fault. But frequently it is, particularly when they are bragging ahead of time about how they're willing to have a shutdown. But here is something that, should Obama be allowed, should they back down this time on Syrian refugees? Even the mild pause in letting them in that Paul Ryan and Republicans have asked for while they develop a proper procedure for examining them and investigating and finding out whether they're legitimate refugees or not. Should they just say, well, gee, we can't have a shutdown, and Obama says he'll veto it? I'm not for shutdowns. I think they've been very harmful to Republicans. But this time, it just seems different to me. I think they have to say no. And what helps them, of course, is that, have you seen the poll numbers on letting in Syrian refugees? Yes, 73%. And higher in some polls. And you ask people, the poll numbers are basically saying, don't let them in now. Maybe later, but not now. Not in 2016, unless you're really sure that these are legitimate refugees and not terrorists sneaking in. Doesn't take many. The FBI now, I guess it's the FBI, now keeps track of all the people they know who have gone from the United States, either American citizens or not, fought with ISIS and have come back. They keep track of those people, and for good reason. And anyway, who knows? Well, anyway, December 11th, that's next week. I think, what is that, next Thursday, is the day when, we'll see. In the meantime, the Senate's going to vote on this refugee bill. We'll see what they do, whether they'd be hard to have a veto-proof majority there. But, at some point, you can't just let Obama say, well, I'm going to veto that, and then, okay, we'll cave. And this is the place to start, I think. That's next week. Okay, finally, Killing Reagan. Some of you have probably read this book. I saw it just last, the bestseller list in the Wall Street Journal, and I think also in the New York Times, and it's #1. the book by Bill O'Reilly and some other fella have written this book, the theme of which is that Ronald Reagan was shot and wounded seriously in March of 1981 outside the Washington Hilton Hotel, and that even though he lived, that wound came back to really harm him in his second term, had a huge effect, and he became basically incompetent as a president in his late years. And there were serious efforts by aides of Ronald Reagan to see whether he needed to be removed under whatever amendment that, the 25th Amendment, it was right on the tip of my tongue, the 25th Amendment, that you can remove a president who is disabled or incompetent or something. Now, here's why I think that's wrong. I happened to, I think it was late, it was in 1987, in the middle of the year, maybe a little later in the year, I happened to interview Ronald Reagan, one-on-one in the Oval Office, and I took with me, Reagan's such a nice guy, and I knew he loved his movie career because I talked to him before, a picture that I had for years of Ronald Reagan when he was making a movie at the Presidio of Monterey in California, which in the 30s, this is 1937, was a cavalry post. And it just happened that the man who turned out to be my grandfather was the post commander. And his daughter married a lieutenant who was in the cavalry there, my parents. And so anyway, we have this picture, I've had it in the house for years, of Reagan there. And he was making a movie called Sergeant Murphy. And I'll bet nobody in this room has seen Sergeant Murphy except for me. And only because a Reagan aide got me a copy of it. He copied one of me. It was a B movie. You know what a B movie was? It was movies when they had double features. I'm old enough to remember double features. That was the second movie, and it was shorter. This one was about 55 minutes. Sergeant Murphy. Sergeant Murphy was Ronald Reagan's horse in the movie. But in any case, so here's Reagan. They're standing there, and he's got on his cavalry gear, and all these women, including my grandmother. And so I brought this thing in to get Reagan to autograph it, which he did, very lovingly, because he autographed it to my mother. And he remembered everything about this movie. I mean, everything. I'd always heard he had a photographic memory, but it was just, he remembered the post, he remembered all of the plot of the movie and the other actors in the movie and all the people he dealt with there, and it was just amazing. But that by itself wouldn't be enough. I don't think, basis of that, could you say that, well, sure, he was perfectly confident and at the top of his game and so on. After that, after we went through the whole thing about the Presidio of Monterey, I interviewed him for about 40 minutes. Just myself and Reagan in the Oval Office, and Reagan was incredibly sharp. I mean, this was 1987, gone through the Iran-Contra affair, scandal, and Reagan had said some things then that he really didn't believe. He did not think that it was he was dealing with the Iranians in guns for hostages or anything like that. He believed that it isn't what happened at all, and said so. And I knew the two deputy press secretaries who were there, Marlon Fitzwater and Tommy Griscom. And when Reagan saying all this stuff, which he really believed, at great length and in great detail, and they're looking at each other, why in the world did we let this guy come in and interview the president? And, I mean, they knew what he really believed, and he went on and on about it. He was incredibly impressive in this interview. It wasn't just, he didn't just tell Hollywood stories, which he would like to do sometimes when he didn't want to answer a question. And he was actually very, very good. So he was not, I mean, I don't think this was somehow a stolen moment in a year of incompetence on his part. This is the way Reagan was. Actually, I talked to him even after he left office, and he was still very sharp. Now, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I don't know, what was it, 4 or 5 years after he left office. There was no sign of anything like that. I haven't gone back to review the transcript of that, which I have a copy of the transcript of that interview, but I just remember it so well. Wrote a long piece about it in the New Republic. That was 1987. Were you there then? Not yet. John hadn't gotten there yet. But now this book, it's based on Reagan being incompetent and not qualified and not up to the speed to be president then in that year, I just think is wrong. By my firsthand knowledge, I think it was painfully wrong, and yet Bill O'Reilly, he won't let go, and the book is selling like crazy. I'm sorry for that, because I think it sullies Reagan's reputation in a very, very untruthful way. I finished my whole page. So I'm going to stop right there. I don't know whether you have time for questions, but I'm happy to take some if you want to, and if there's time. Okay, well, yeah, you have a microphone there. I guess that means you are going to have questions.
I'll ask the first one.
Okay.
The last couple of days, we've been hearing a lot out of D.C. about the potential Senate involvement in a repeal of Obamacare.
Yeah.
Could you give us an update on what's really happening, and is there really light at the end of the tunnel that we might see a repeal and a replace?
Yeah, no, not yet. I don't think so. You know, they've done that. They voted in the House many, many times. I think when you get to Obamacare, and the Syrian issue is different. When you get to Obamacare, I mean, Democrats are pretty unified, and you're going to wind up with a filibuster that they'll be able to pull off. You know, they got 40. The Democrats put together 44 votes against 42 votes to have a successful filibuster against defunding Planned Parenthood. And I just don't think they can wind up with anything, except if they do what they have said they might do, and that do it under the arrangement called, what do you call it? Reconciliation. It's a very useful crowd to hear today. Don't know what I would have done without it. Tommy Evans, I'd have been just calling him Tommy. If they do that, they can get it through without a filibuster, and then Reagan will veto it. Can they get a veto-proof majority? You know, some of these things. Look, on almost anything that Republicans really want so far, the best they can do is force Obama to veto something. And, you know, clearly he'd veto that. So Obamacare isn't going to be repealed. But I would like to see the Senate vote, because they haven't. It's all been in the House. John?
Fred, I have two questions for you. One of them historical and one of them prospective. Okay. The historical question is, imagine that Jack Kemp were around and making policy and in Congress today, and we obviously have a much higher ratio of debt to the national economy than we did when Kemp was formulating his ideas in the 70s and 80s. The deficits may not be as large as some of those in the early 80s, but the debt is way bigger.
Yes.
So do you think that would affect Jack Kemp's view of the importance of balancing the budget versus tax cuts? And then the second question is, what do you think is going to happen in the Senate races and control the U.S. Senate in 2016?
Let me answer the first one, and that is Kemp. You know, this is a distinction that Paul Ryan, the acolyte of Jack Kemp, makes today. He said Jack would have been back in the 70s and 80s. Kemp would have said, "Don't worry about the deficit. Don't worry about debt. We want the economy to grow," and it was growing with relatively low inflation. But it is different now. And Paul Ryan says you have to take that into account, and you have to take that into account when you're considering what tax cuts you want. So I think Kemp would have looked differently at the situation now, recognizing that the debt is so large and has an effect on the economy in not kind ways. So that would have changed, I think, his way of thinking. But then back in the 70s, if you had to choose between a rising deficit and cutting taxes and stirring growth, he was always for growth. But it just wouldn't be that simple today. And what was the second one? It was
U.S. Senate races in 2016.
You know, the Senate races, the worrisome thing about Senate races for Republicans, I think, would be if Donald Trump were the nominee, because these Senate races are so affected by the presidential race. And you want a presidential candidate, one who can win, and by a substantial margin if possible. And I think that's possible. I mean, Hillary Clinton is such a flawed candidate, and that you could win well, but not someone whose negatives are so high and who will lose so much of the minority vote and the immigrant vote, and even a lot of Republicans who at least tell me now they won't vote for him. I think it'd be hard for them to vote for Hillary Clinton. But because of his negatives, I just don't think Trump can win. You really, and whereas somebody like Rubio can win.
Fred, what do you think Jack's reaction would be to Trump's candidacy? And the second question would be, Congressman Babin has to defund the refugees altogether. Is that the backup to the pause in the Congress?
Well, there certainly, and I talked to some House Republicans yesterday who want to have that as be the backup, that you defund the ability of the president to bring in all these Syrian refugees now. I don't know whether we'll see what happens with it, and we'll see what happens in the Senate.
Because as you know, Newt is advocating for that. He is forced. He thinks that we can win on that issue.
No, I do too.
He's willing.
I think
he's willing to shut the government down.
I think it's a winnable issue, and there are Republicans that are going to push for that. When the Republicans are going to have to vote, I mean, they've already passed that earlier bill, but then they'll have to decide whether to put that in the spending bill. And in the House, I think they probably will. The Senate will be a lot tougher.
Now, what would Jack's reaction be to?
Jack's reaction to Trump would be that I like his tax reform plan, but nothing else. But he would particularly be appalled at the way Trump talks about immigrants and talks about other people and attacks other Republicans and insults people and mocks them. I mean, it's just so foreign to his style of politics. And Kemp's idea was, you win elections by having better ideas than the other party. And that doesn't seem to be exactly the idea of Donald Trump. And the way he talks about Mexicans and immigrants and so on, it's just completely foreign to Jack's politics. And the other thing is, look, Kemp was a conservative. He was a conservative on foreign policy issues, on domestic issues, and on social issues. Who knows where Donald Trump is? He was, pro-abortion just a few years ago. Now he says he's not. He's not pro-free trade now, and on just issue after issue. I also think that if a candidate has to come off, or a Republican to win, has to come off as you don't need to be for some a proposal that would give a quick path to citizenship for illegal immigrants here, but you need to come off as pro-immigrant if you're going to win a necessary chunk of the Hispanic vote, the Asian American vote, which is growing very quickly. You have to. Trump can't do that. And Kemp was very pro-immigrant as well. So Kemp would have been, my colleague Mort overuses the word that Kemp would have been appalled. But I think he's right. He would be appalled at Trump, but would concede that Trump's tax reform bill, which would lower the top rate to 25%, would be, he would speak favorably of it.
Do you think that the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email or foundation issues is going to turn into anything that might influence the presidential race?
Well, they already have. I mean, just look at her numbers on is she honest? Is she trustworthy? It's by nearly 2-to-1. Americans say no. Now, Democrats are better, but that's just getting her the Democratic nomination. I mean, Democrats, I thought, well, maybe they don't understand how much she's lied about these things and so on, but they do. They don't care.
Well, let me follow that up.
Yeah.
Do you think the potential for an indictment of some kind is possible?
No. I mean, President Obama would have to sign off on that, and I don't think he would. But it's a serious investigation by the FBI, and there's a good reason for a serious investigation. But look at all the, I mean, these emails, there was something like 8,000 pages of emails came out yesterday, and they weren't all that damaging, but you can see, emails to flattering emails from Lanny Davis, who's a big supporter of hers, and she was lapping it up, and but they're going to continue to come out, and they're always going to get attention, and they're not going to be helpful to her. And I think the really untouched issue is the foundation, because we know now that she said, while she was Secretary of State, foreign companies or foreign interests would not be giving money to the foundation. Well, of course they did. Oh, well, I didn't know about those, or something or other she'd say. I mean, that is going to be a big issue, the foundation. And we learn more and more about it, how she was meeting many times with people who were giving money to the foundation. And, if somebody who has business with the U.S. government and pays Bill Clinton $750,000 for a speech, it's not that he's that great a speaker. I mean, there's something going on there. And look, you can say, well, gee, we know about some of this stuff now, but her Democratic opponents are not saying any of this stuff. The Republicans will.
I think you've already answered this question, but I was wondering if either the FBI director or Trey Gowdy, are they going to be able to mount anything significant against Hillary? And is the FBI director in any way under the thumb of Obama?
Well, he works for him. That's the problem. He works for the Attorney General. The Attorney General works for the President, and for that reason, I just don't think the Obama administration would allow an indictment to happen. But I don't know whether stranger things have happened, stranger than that. But I would be very surprised. One of the things that the FBI director has said that has crossed the Obama administration on Syrian refugees, and has said, we don't have the kind of material that we'd usually have to interview and assess a refugee. He said, I mean, all the records, I mean, what are we going to get them from Syria? We're going to get their records that the government would have there? Well, of course not. Those are not going to be available. And that in other words, the vetting process that they could do now would be incomplete. And I'm sure President Obama did not want to hear that. So the FBI director, Comey, has shown some, at least surprising to me, independence already.
I know Jack Kemp became HUD secretary at one point.
He did.
But I'm curious how he could become known as the bleeding heart conservative, as you say, where his signature was supply-side economics, and it seems like supply-side economics is more associated with giving tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires now than anything else.
Yeah, well, he thought that conservatism and free market ideas were what could have a huge impact on the lives of poor people, African Americans, Hispanics, immigrants, and believe that the Republican Party should again become, and my colleague Mort Kondracki loves to talk about this, the land of Lincoln again. And what you do that is you broaden the base by bringing in new people. Karl Rove has a new book about the 1896 election when William McKinley won the presidency, and McKinley did this. McKinley went after, in that case, McKinley went after laborers white working-class people and brought them into the Republican Party and won a smashing election in 1896. And that's what Kemp wanted to do. And the difference with Kemp is, in the African-American community, in immigrant communities, and so on, Kemp showed up. He would speak there. He would talk about supply-side economics and tax cuts and enterprise zones and school choice and all these things. And he thought conservatives and free market ideas were what could lift people out of poverty, and tried to convert many of them to supply side. I have to say he converted some, not many, but he certainly believed in that. And Paul Ryan, to some extent, has taken up that effort. Be hard to do as Speaker because he's so busy, but and I'm sure he'll do some of it. I mean, already has, and I'm sure he'll do some more, and I hope so, because some of those communities, look, the African American community is very democratic, but there's a big difference from getting 3% of that vote and 10%. And the Hispanic community, I mean, look at the difference there, where George W. Bush got 44%. In 2004, and Mitt Romney got 27% in 2012. If he'd gotten what Bush had gotten, he would have lost by under 1 million votes. And maybe that would have changed if he'd made a serious effort, Romney, to win Hispanic votes. And a lot of it is showing up in these communities and listening to what people there have to say. And agreeing with them when you can, and supporting. You know, the one thing you don't have to do to win the immigrant communities, you don't have to promise a special path to citizenship. Now, you might want to say you're for legalization, because that would help. But even Cory Gardner, who was elected to the Senate in Colorado, who really made a huge effort to get Hispanic voters that Republicans had not gotten before, and got about 40%, but just spent so much time with Hispanic voters that it really lifted the amount he got without promising a path to citizenship or to legalization. So there's a lot you can do. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Fred. It's great to have you here. A reminder, an autographed copy of Fred's book would make a great holiday gift. You all have a very wonderful holiday, and we'll see you after the first of the year. Thank you.